Hi there, welcome to the screencast for Chapter 2 of They Say, I Say on the art of summarizing. This screencast is not meant to be a replacement for the book, but a supplement. It's an opportunity to go over the concepts that the book pointed out, to hear them said a different way, to get a different perspective, to get some elaboration and feedback from me. So first of all, we have to talk about what is summarizing. You're familiar with this term, you've done it before. Basically, summarizing is anything that you use from a source that you put into your own words. So, this might be what you normally think of as paraphrasing. When the authors say summarizing in this textbook, they really mean paraphrasing, and that you're not always going to be summarizing everything the source says. You're going to be summarizing a single viewpoint or idea that they have. And so that's the first concept that I think you really need to wrap your head around. You've been trained that summary means to summarize everything the author had to say. And in academic writing, that's certainly not what we want you to do. We want you to summarize a viewpoint, not an entire essay. So just take a minute, pause the video, consider what are your opinions on, your thoughts about, your experiences with summarizing so far. So summarizing is really the central tool as it relates to using sources. Some people want to avoid it. They don't want to delve too deeply into their source's viewpoint, or maybe they're scared that they're going to summarize too much. And some people do it too much. They'll do that because they have no faith in their own ideas, and so all they want to do is repeat what other people had to say. Some people might do it in a very cursory list-like kind of way if they're not making a connection to their own idea. So there's a lot of ways that you can certainly go wrong with summary. The key is to find a balance between the original author's ideas and summarizing them, while also highlighting what interests you, because this is now part of your paper. One way of doing this is this guy named Peter Elbow, this little dude here in this picture, had a theory that he called the believing game. And what that means is if we're going to summarize well and fairly, we have to try to inhabit the worldview of the source that we're dealing with, of the person whose opinion we're summarizing. Readers shouldn't be able to tell from your summary itself, from the way you're presenting their viewpoints, whether you agree or disagree. If you can't do this well, you're going to write biased summaries. So one thing that you might want to do to kind of practice this is there is an exercise on your practice sheet that asks you to try to play the believing game. And I would certainly encourage you to do that. If you can inhabit their worldview and summarize their argument from their point of view, you will write a less biased summary of their ideas. So there's an article in your textbook. It's on page 391. It's called Don't Blame the Eater by David Zinchenko. And I would encourage you to take a minute right now to read it. It's short, and having read it is going to help you understand the following examples. You can't understand what's good or bad about a summary if you haven't read the thing that's being summarized. So pause the video, read the Zinchenko article, and then come on back. All right, so here we have a summary sentence. In his article, Don't Blame the Eater, David Zinchenko accuses the fast food companies of an evil conspiracy to make people fat. I disagree because these companies have to make money. Okay, so now what's wrong with this summary? Well, first of all, it's really slanted. It's really biased. He accuses them of an evil conspiracy. That's not accurate to what he actually said in his article. So the other thing with this is that you have to stick with your summary long enough to give them credit. So this person didn't do that. They just sort of made this blatant statement of what they believed Zinchenko was saying that is inaccurate, and then they run away from it. They say, I disagree because these companies have to make money. It doesn't even really fit. It's very quickly abandoned in terms of making their own viewpoint, and their own viewpoint's not really connected with what they even said. Now, it's natural to summarize others quickly. You certainly don't want to spend a ton of time, not several paragraphs, summarizing a source, but you have to be fair and give them the airtime that it's going to take to accurately represent what their viewpoint is. One thing you want to do is avoiding the closest cliche syndrome, which is something that this particular thing does. It's really easy to do when you don't play the believing game, when you don't take the time to inhabit their worldview and figure out what they really are trying to say from their unbiased from their perspective, with you being unbiased. You want to be careful to do that instead of collapsing it into something that you've already heard or already know. A lot of times we are very quick to judge somebody's argument based on what we think they're saying, what's the normal argument we hear about that subject, rather than what they're actually saying. So here's an example of a good summary of the Zinchenko article. Because remember, while we do want to be fair, your goal is also your own response. So the summary that you're giving has to fit your agenda while still being true to fit the text. So here's an example. In his article, Don't Blame the Eater, David Zinchenko argues that today's fast food chains fill the nutritional void in children's lives left by their overtaxed working parents. With many parents working long hours and unable to supervise what their children eat, Zinchenko claims children today regularly turn to low-cost, calorie-laden foods that the fast food chains are all too eager to supply. When he himself was a young boy, for instance, he and his single mother was away at work, he ate Taco Bell, McDonald's, and other chains on a regular basis and ended up being overweight. Zinchenko's hope is that with the new spate of lawsuits against the food industry, other children with working parents will have healthier choices available to them, and they will not, like him, become obese. In my view, however, it is the parents and not the food chains who are responsible for their children's obesity. While it is true that many of today's parents work long hours, there are still several things that parents can do to guarantee that their children eat healthy foods. Obviously, this would continue, but let's talk for a minute about what makes it a good a good summary. Several of Zinchenko's points fall under this umbrella. Your point, the person who's writing this, is that it's the parents, not the fast food industry. So you highlight that in your description of his points, what he says about the parents versus the fast food industry. The summary of him leads naturally to your point. It makes sense why we're going to talk about parents, because we talked about what Zinchenko said about parents up here in our summary of him. A less focused summary than this one might iterate what he says about the fast food industry, but ignore what he says about parents. This is a really good example of what we mean when we say that your summary has to fit your agenda. This summary that we see up here is accurate to what Zinchenko said. It's fair, it's appropriate length, it gives him enough airtime, but it is also leading us to what we actually have to say. So, to recap, you want to make a fair summary that's accurate to what the author is saying, but it also points towards your second paragraph, your thesis. You need to make sure that your they say and your I say are well matched, that you're actually responding to what they actually said. And you want to avoid list summaries. List summaries are an inventory of the author's original points. They often use words like then, also, these kinds of things. They don't show a connection to your overall claim. These are the kind of summaries that you've unfortunately been taught to do up to this point. And there's a really good example in the textbook on page 36 of a list summary. It says, the author says many different things about his subject. First he says blah blah blah, then he makes the point that this. In addition, he also says blah blah blah. Then he writes, also he shows that this, and then he says this other point. That's an example of a list summary. That's not what we're going for. Your goal is to summarize the author's views accurately in a way that fits your own agenda. You don't want to ignore or misrepresent the source. You want to think of the summary as a joint property. This is both the author's, and it's also now becoming yours because it's included in your argument. So the final point to make about summary is having to do with signal verbs. And you guys are really used to using accurate and precise verbs because we've been working with this for a while now. But signal verbs are ones that capture authorial intent, what the author is doing. And things like says, discusses, believes, talks about, they're functional, but they're really inaccurate. They drain the passion and voice from your source, but also from your voice. When you use bland signal verbs, we do it because we want to play it safe. We don't want to offend. We don't want to misread. We also sometimes, I think, do it out of laziness because we don't want to take the time to choose something specific. We don't want to take the time to figure out what the text is really doing. They're really dull. So you instead want to choose things like vivid and precise verbs. She demonstrates that. They celebrate the fact that. He admits this. Those are really clear, strong verbs that, as long as they're accurate, better capture what the author's actually saying. The paragraph, the example that I just read from page 36, that was a list summary. The author says different things. He makes the point that, he says, he writes, he shows that. Those are also really good examples of bland verbs. Signal verbs would help our summary tremendously. I have on these next two slides some examples of signal verbs. To be honest, you've already got a list that you've been working with, and these verbs are also on pages 39 and 40 of your textbook, and they're meant to be used as kind of a reference. If you're stuck for, okay, what is the author really doing here? Sometimes these verbs can help give you an idea of how you could more precisely and accurately capture what the author's viewpoint is. And that's it. The end of your screencast on Chapter 2 summarizing. I would strongly encourage you to make your way over to the practice exercises for Chapter 2 that are attached to the workshop Google Doc. And you can practice with the believing game. You can practice with some other summary kinds of activities. Thanks for watching.